Even though Courbet's allegorical painting of the painter's studio was an imaginary concoction, it does remind us that the 19th century was very much a time when the idea came into vogue that the studio was not just a private workshop but could be a quasi-public social space. By the time Australia began to establish a self-consciously national school of painting towards the end of the 19th century, painters such as Tom Roberts were used to the idea of the studio as itself a kind of work of art. In Tom Roberts's 1888 portrait of Mrs. Lewis Abrahams, now in the National Gallery, Victoria, the sitter is in the typical 1880s avant-garde studio of aesthetic style. This is Roberts's studio in Grosvenor Chambers in Collins Street, 1888. In the background is a large Chinese jar stuffed with bulrushes, creating a gentle curve that unites with the cane chair to embrace the composition. There are fashionable bits and pieces of Japonesery, a fan, a scroll painting, a lantern around, and the teacups, well, I don't need to point them out, you can see them, placed on the large lacquerwork tray create the idea that this is a social visit. That's plausible given that Mrs. Abrahams was the wife of one of Roberts's fellow painters, whose place in art history has rather been relegated to the supplier of the cigar box lids on which Roberts, Streeton and their fellow artists painted the impressions that constituted the famous 9x5 Impressions exhibition in 1888. The taste for the decorated studio was at its height at precisely the time when artists began to be valued for their contribution to a society otherwise thought to be preoccupied with business or triviality in the 1880s and 1890s. In England, the world of Whistler and Oscar Wilde was one in which there was little distinction between brilliance in art, in conversation, and in decoration. And if one was an artist, all of one's life was to be a work of art. There was not a corner of life not susceptible to artful construction, and that, of course, included the artist's studio. Artists became adept at strewing picturesque objects around their spaces, preferably anything Japanese or Chinese, exotic fabrics, chunks of antique sculpture, harps, and mandolins. In Australia, the most exaggerated example of this craze was the Melbourne studio of Karl Kahler, an Austrian-born painter who was a contemporary of the Heidelberg School artists. Kahler had a reputation as a portraitist of children and is now remembered mostly for his large paintings of Derby Flemington that were widely distributed as prints. I don't think there was ever an artist's studio in Australia to rival Karl Kahler's immense conglomeration of knickknacks photographed here in the mid-1880s. Looks more like a high street antique shop than a studio, and how he ever got into it and got any work done is a bit of a miracle. But of course, this isn't really a studio in which to get work done. This is a studio which is a background for elegant social intercourse. When Kahler moved to America, he sold the contents of this studio. Not much is known about Kahler. After he left Melbourne, he died. He's thought to have died in the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. In the 20th century, the studio of the printmaker and stylist Thea Proctor in Sydney was an admittedly less cluttered but no less artfully devised setting for the taking of tea. Pictures of Thea Proctor's studio here were taken in 1923 to accompany an article in The Home magazine. So they're slightly pixelated because they're actually taken from the magazine. In The Home, the studio is described as offering a keen and cool delight to the visitor arriving at the top of a flight of stairs from the city street below. This studio was down near Circular Quay, by the way, in George Street. The studio had plain white walls and bare floorboards and pieces of lacquered furniture, Books of the drawings of Ingres lay open on the table, a couple of small Japanese paintings hung on the wall. There are two things that we can't quite get from these black and white photographs. And there's another. The first thing that we can't quite get here is the colour sense, the colour scheme in the studio. The 1923 article describes, quote, notes of deep sheer blue, at intervals a high note of lemon yellow, a glimpse of engine green through a white enamelled door, and on the shelf and table hints of a vivid Chinese lacquer red. End of quote. And the other thing missing in these photographs is the artist herself. She was very shy of being photographed. There aren't very many photographs of Thea Proctor at all. And in a sense, that doesn't really matter, because this studio is really a kind of self-portrait of the artist. And if that sounds like a far-fetched interpretation, I think it would have been supported by the idea that this painting by Margaret Preston, with whom Thea Proctor shared a modernist vision in the 1920s, created what I think is actually a kind of portrait of her fellow artist. This is 1923, the same year as the photographs of the studio. We get a sense here very much of the colour effect of the studio. And the painting is entitled Thea Proctor's Tea Party. Is there a contemporary Australian equivalent of Thea Proctor? Well, in Ian Lloyd's photographs, Marion Borgelt inhabits a pristine whiting environment. But even here we get a sense that actually work is being done. It's a very constructed space, but it is a workspace, not an artwork all in its own right. I think actually it's Ken Doane, likewise someone with an eye for the decorative, who's the true heir to Thea Proctor. She, I think, would have been very comfortable in Ken Doane's white-painted room with the bare floorboards, setting off the flashes of bright colour and the attractive glimpses of Sydney Harbour. Nothing was accidental in Thea Proctor's studio. The art books, the Japanese paintings were not accidental, and they pointed a visitor in certain art historical directions. In her case, they declared a belief in the importance of drawing and the decorative. Artists have always wanted to signal their indebtedness to the great art traditions of the past in their studios. They have always, perhaps more meaningfully, wanted to remind themselves of the things they want to emulate in or the works of tradition that have exerted some unspoken fascination. Reminded here of the fact that before he went out painting in the landscape, Cézanne regularly used to visit the Louvre on the day before in order to get his mind into gear with the great tradition which he hoped to emulate. This is a photograph of a corner of the studio of the French painter Bonnard. And it was photographed by Alexander Liberman. Liberman really was the first, I think, to put together a really major picture book about artists in their studios. It was published in 1960, first published in 1960, went into another edition, and it was called The Artist in His Studio. And it was published as the culmination of a photographic project of mostly French studios. He photographed for American Vogue. So there are two insistent motifs in the artist studios photographed by Ian Lloyd. The collections of postcards and books that we can see on shelves and scattered about the studio floor, rather like the corner of Bonnard's studio. We can tell a lot about Bonnard's enthusiasms from this particular group of works. In Joe Furlonger's studio, we can see that he's got pinboards. There's various old master religious paintings. There's a picture by the Douanier Rousseau, and perhaps more tellingly, there's a catalogue of Matisse's graphic works lying open there. That devotee of Old Master, Peter Churcher, we can see what he has on his shelves. Thanks to Ian Lloyd's photographs, we can actually read the titles on all the books, or many of them. There's a catalogue of Rembrandt. So there is definitely the proximity of the old master here. And we can easily see the artists who Angus Nivison admires. There's lots of... that's actually a Giacometti catalogue. There's a Bonnard catalogue there. There's a couple of other Bonnard catalogues strewn around. I hesitated to include this, by the way, in a lecture in a library. I hope none of these are library books. I can hear you saying, is that any way to treat books? Well, this pales into insignificance by comparison with the messiest studio of all time, and that is the studio of Francis Bacon. Picture of a corner of it. Of all the artist studios of the 20th century, I think some stand out in the mind. Monet's Garden Paradise at Giverny, Giacometti's rickety rooms that we've looked at, Picasso's grand and ramshackle elegance at his villa at La Californie, Matisse's studio on the Côte d'Azur, where he sat or stood to make the brilliant late paper cutouts and decorations for the chapel at Vence. But the most compelling of them all would have to be Francis Bacon's studio at 7 Rees Mews in London, which was Bacon's studio from 1961 until his death in 1992. It's more of an indoor rubbish heap than a studio, or perhaps the metaphor is compost heap, being turned over at intervals, layers of litter providing a mulch to feed the artist's visual imagination. This is a painting by Bacon's contemporary, the English painter Frank Auerbach. It's called EOW, Reclining, and it was painted in 1970. And it's a typical painting of Frank Auerbach. The paint is as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. I've seen photographs of Auerbach's studio, but I haven't included one here because I doubt if any of the photographs live up to the word picture of Auerbach's studio written by Robert Hughes, as vivid a description as Genet's evocation of Giacometti's studio. Robert Hughes. Auerbach's door opens on a scene of dinginess and clutter. The studio is actually a generous-sized room, but it seems constricted at first. All peeling surfaces, blistered paint, spalling plaster, mounds and craters of paint, piles of newspapers and books crammed into rickety shelves, a mirror so frosted with dust that movements reflected inside it are barely decipherable. It is a midden heap. Because Auerbach paints thick and scrapes off all the time, the floor is encrusted with a deposit of dried paint so deep that it slopes upwards several inches from the wall to the easel. One walks gingerly on the remains of innumerable pictures. Where he sets his drawing easel, this lava is black from accumulated charcoal dust. I changed the lino 3 times, Auerbach says. The last time quite recently, less than 10 years ago. If I didn't, the paint would be up to here. He gestures at thigh height. And then a few days later, Leonardo said painting is better than sculpture because painters kept clean. How wrong he was. Robert Hughes continues, the essence of this place is that things do not change in it, except that dust accumulates, waste pigment slowly builds its reef on the floor, the light fluctuates, models, as few as possible, and nearly always the same ones. That includes EOW, one of his favourite models for many, many years. They come, they arrive, they sit for 3 hours and go. Paintings and drawings are finished and are taken away. The fascination, and this is back to Bacon's studio, another view of the studio at 7 Rees Mews. The fascination here, I think, is with a studio as a setting that absolutely suits the temperament and approach of the artist. creating almost a portrait of the painter himself. Bacon's work is claustrophobic, troubled, full of a kind of compressed violence that erupts through its surfaces. Bacon was a painter who embraced the random, the accidental, and the studio seems as in tune with his temperament and the work that came out of it as the clean, clear spaces of Mondrian, whose studio was almost bare, but for his own paintings and a single record player, or the coolly controlled space of Gerhard Richter, with whom we began. Thinking about Australian equivalents, there really only, I think, are a handful of famous artist studios. Norman Lindsay's Springwood studio springs to mind, an Olympus created in the bush at Springwood, Clifton Pugh's Dunmuchen. It would probably be a latter-day version of the same ideal out at Eltham. Lloyd Rees was a favourite with photographers, not only for his craggy face, here photographed by David Moore, but for his Northwood studio, where paint had accumulated over many, many years on all surfaces. This is an interesting view. This is by Lewis Morley, showing Lloyd Rees working on a late painting, seen through the window of the Northwood studio. Lloyd Rees had the same studio for a long time, as indeed did Robert Clipple, and this is a photograph taken by David Moore of Robert Clipple in the 1960s, and this is a much later photograph. It doesn't actually capture the extraordinary profusion that was the experience of Clipple's house and studio in Birchgrove in Sydney. Every single room had been completely colonised by variations of works of art. There was a collage room, there was a metal sculpture room, there was a wooden sculpture room, and the artist would move between them, working, accumulating, building, recombining. And when I visited him there in the 1980s, there were great heaps of magazines that were going to become collages at some point. There was enough raw material in that studio to keep an artist of Clipple's mental inventiveness going, I think, for decades and decades and decades. You don't really get that, but you do, I think, get something of the sense of a man completely in tune with his material. And another studio of great longevity, that of Margaret Olley. This is Margaret Olley, photographed by Greg Waite, and of course Margaret Olley appears in Ian Lloyd's photographs. You can see some similarities, but the accumulation of objects and materials and dried flower arrangements and so on has become ever greater. Margaret Olley is a great subject for artists and photographers. And perhaps one of the most well-known artist studios in Australia is that of Brett Whiteley. This is Brett Whiteley photographed by Greg Waite, and here's a studio view, and you can see the artist swinging from the ceiling around this group of works that he's working on in the studio. Now, Brett Whiteley's studio is now a museum, and I don't think there's anything more depressingly sad places than artist studios that have been turned into museums. No matter how well looked after they are, things crumble or get covered with dust. Pictures on the walls fade. Attractive objects to touch have to be put behind perspex or barriers. There's sorts of things that we can put up with in a historic house, but I think in an artist's studio you need the presence of the artist to give it meaning. Without the spirit of creativity, studios really have no life. They've really got no reason to exist. So let's not have too many artists' studios. Museums turned into museums. And I think that's why photographic records such as Ian Lloyd's studio portraits are so important, because they record the artist in his or her setting, and like all important portraiture, create the vividness, the life, and the presence of the subject, which connects with us now and will connect across time. This is a photograph again by David Moore of Maria Gazzard at work on a ceramic piece. That wonderful absorption, the wonderful rhythm in this image is really the life force, I think, that we look for in artists' studios. In this lecture, I've looked at some of the history of the genre of depictions of artists in their studios, starting with Rembrandt and some Australian versions of the genre. But I think Australia has something new and quite unique and distinctive to add to the genre that Ian Lloyd has included in his photographs, and which has created some memorable and distinctively Australian images. And I mean the way in which many Indigenous artists have used only lightly modified open air as their studios. Verandas, the trays of utes, the shades of trees. Here, the place is the thing. Not the size of the room, nor the quality of the light filtering through skylights or the presence of mirrors. What's important here is the place in which the artist paints and the connectedness of that place to the subject matter of the artist's works and the sustaining communities of family and people. This is one of Greg Waite's photographs of Emily Ngwarri. That's her hand, wonderfully evocative image. And that's a portrait of her in front of one of her works. Ian Lloyd's a portrait of David Moangel. And Francis Rice's endearing Paddy's Lunch, this is called, Paddy Stewart at work. It's another version of the artist's studio. In one of Ian Lloyd's most powerful works, we have Gloria Pettiari seeming to be a kind of almost like an energy centre for the composition work on one of her paintings. And then we have Alison Moulter, whose studio is in fact the landscape, the ultimate open-air studio. These photographs of Ian Lloyd's and some of these photographs we've been looking at, I think, are about sharing. The sense we have from Ian's photographs is the feeling that these artists are sharing something with us, closely guarded secrets of creative process and the physical settings in which those processes take place. And our gratitude for that sharing is gratitude for the privilege of understanding something more about how art is made and what it says. Just a little while ago in this talk I put the question, are there any famous Australian artist studios? And you'll no doubt, your brains have been ticking over and you've been thinking, he hasn't mentioned Ian Fairweather. And this is a photograph by David Beale of Ian Fairweather in his studio. And I've chosen to present this as a spread from the 1969 book In the Making, which I think is one of the best books about the creative process that's ever been produced in Australia. In the Making was described on its front flap as a very special book, unlike any book on the act of creation which has been published before, because it tries to give the actual feel of the creative process. It's the creation of four people who are artists in their own right: Craig McGregor, David Beale, David Moore, Harry Williamson. And Craig McGregor wrote a great deal of the text. David Beale took this photograph of Ian Fairweather, part one of a sequence, and David Moore took many of the photographs in the book, and Harry Williamson designed the book. So the book itself was the very essence of a creative collaboration. The book opens with a sequence of photographs by David Moore of Michael Johnson in his studio. It's a sequence taken over 8 hours, and it captures the light changing from morning to evening. David Moore loved this sequence of photographs, and he loved that light shift from cool to warm. And this sequence, I think, is the most complete expression of the idea that the compilers of the book set for themselves to give the actual feel of the creative process. Remember Jean Genet's description of Giacometti working on a sculpture. The whole studio vibrates and comes to life. Well, here, in this ballet of creation, the whole studio vibrates and comes to life. The sequence ends with the artist looking at the semi-completed work. Continuity. In Studio, Ian Lloyd's exhibition, he captures the same artist, Michael Johnson, 4 decades later. And he's doing the same thing. He's standing in reverie among half-completed paintings. And he's doing the same thing as Rembrandt did 4.5 centuries ago, when he captured the artist not painting, but thinking about painting. The forms of painting may change, but the power and mystery of the creative process continues, and long may it.